It is the Sengoku Jidai. Besieged and surrounded by his enemies, a lord pays a group of men to see his only child to safety. But do they have the skill to ensure her safety? And can they even be trusted? For this is an age of honor and treachery, of blood and valor, of gold and steel. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. According to Wikipedia and interviews with Miller, the next 4 story arcs in KOTOR the comic were intended to be interlocking stories, all of them inspired by a famous quote by Yoda from The Phantom Menace.
Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
Hence the title of today's offering, Days of Fear, and its 3 sequels, Nights of Anger, Days of Hate, and Nights of Suffering. And the ominous-sounding titles are appropriate, as, to quote Miller, the arcs, not coincidentally, refer to a downward spiral of events spoken of in the movies by Yoda. And here, following the Mandalorian onslaught, things are beginning to go from bad to worse for the Republic. It's like 1940 in Europe, with one country falling after another. The reference to World War II is appropriate, as Miller's grandfather had served in the Navy during World War II, and he clearly took a bit of inspiration here for some of the settings and events that we encounter. I'll point them out as we come to them. The only other detail of note here is that from this point forward, the character arcs and plot elements became so intertwined and convoluted that Miller literally had to use a dry erase board to keep track of them all. Once again, we have Dustin Weaver and Brian Ching alternating on interior art. Weaver drawing parts 1 and 3 of Days of Fear, with Brian Ching doing part 2, as well as all 3 covers with some help from Michael Atiyeh. At any rate, remember how back in Reunion, Camper and Jor-El went in disguise on Telarath? Well, it turns out those disguises may have been less than airtight, as Days of Fear begins with some augmented Duro ominously recognizing Camper from somewhere and informing his master that he's found what he's looking for. Meanwhile, as per the agreement in Reunion, Griff has paid Jor-El and Camper with enough funds to resupply and refuel their ship, The Last Resort, so that they can find a new world and start over again. Zane is sorry to see them go, especially Jor-El, though they do at least leave him with a parting gift, a pair of vambraces laced with fricite, one of the rare substances that are resistant to lightsabers. The ability to obtain such a substance and the know-how to make it into armor would make Camper an obscenely wealthy man. Unfortunately, Camper keeps all that know-how in his memory, and his memory is not the best. In fact, both his mental and physical health have been getting worse since they had to flee from Taris back in commencement. Jor-El is hopeful that once they find a new world and settle down, Camper's condition will improve. And so, leaving Zane and Griff on Raltier, Jor-El and Camper take The Last Resort and LB back into space. As they depart, they note the Republic fleet gathering around Raltier, and hope that Zane and Griff will be able to sneak past them. Later, while Camper is tending to some minor maintenance, he notices one of the supply crates, the ones that they took aboard on Raltier, is open, just before he is attacked by what was hiding in that supply crate, a Zerka Arms HK series assassin droid. Designation HK-24. Apparently, HK droids are programmed to be very talkative, although 24's dialogue isn't nearly as snappy as that of his famous cousin, let's say. However, it is competent enough to nearly overpower Jor-El and LB before suddenly being taken out by a character we haven't seen in a while, the rogue Mandalorian Roland Dyer. Apparently, he had decided that Coruscant wasn't the place for him to go, and instead had been hiding out aboard The Last Resort all this time. He'd been intending to get off in one of the other stops, but apparently he wanted to leave without anyone noticing him, and there was never an opportunity. Sure. Jarael is far too concerned for Camper's health to worry about Roland's story and whether or not it checks out. And since he seems willing, if not eager, to help her, she's willing to take the man at his word. Unfortunately, what happens to them next will have to wait for the next arc, Knights of Anger. However, there is one noteworthy detail for you to remember for Knights of Anger, and it's the fact that HK24 refers to both Camper and Jarael as Arcanian offshoots. Just be sure to keep that in mind for next time. In the meantime, while Zane is still worried about being recognized and caught, Griff is full of confidence, and in fact has already arranged their own transport off of Raltier. That is to say, he's arranged to have a ship stolen for them. Unfortunately, the spaceship thief, a Trandoshan named Slisk, has decided that the original 9,000 he was promised up front is no longer sufficient and instead tries to demand more money from Griff. Griff tries to talk his way out of it, but that doesn't work. Fortunately for our heroes, it seems that Slisk has something of a chip on his shoulder, and so what does he start doing?
He starts monologuing.
He goes on and on about how he's been seen as sort of a failure among his people, how even his own mother didn't like him. All the while, Zane is trying and failing not to laugh at how ridiculous the situation is. Luckily, Griff is always quick on his mental feet, and he and Zane trick Slisk into being under a damaged light pole. Zane pushes it over with the force, and Griff saves Slisk's life. Griff knows that Trandoshan culture includes the idea of the life debt, where if you save someone's life, you owe them big time. Unfortunately, Griff didn't know that, just like with Wookiees, a Trandoshan under life debt is sworn to the service of their savior for life. Which means that while Griff no longer owes Slisk any money because a life debt is beyond price, it means there's no getting rid of the Trandoshan now. Well, to quote the Snivian himself, cheap help is cheap help. They take off from Raltier, managing to escape the people that Slisk stole the ship from. They make orbit, only to be addressed by the Republic fleet. It turns out that their new ship, the Little Bivoli, was a provisioning ship contracted to the Navy, meaning that they now have a choice of either falling in formation or getting blown out of the sky. Give you one guess which one they choose. And so our story transitions over to Seroko, a world being used as a staging area for the Republic forces near the Mandalorian front. Zane is understandably terrified of being recognized while surrounded by military personnel, but Griff is ever one to make the best of a bad situation, and it turns out that while Slisk may have been a lousy bounty hunter, he is an excellent cook. As a consequence, the Little Bivoli is now the most popular eatery in the region, especially among all the Republic troops waiting to head for the front. Especially if they want a good piece of Bivoli tempari, which in fact is a reference to an actual food from the now defunct Star Wars MMO, Star Wars Galaxies. Although honestly, when I first read the name Little Bivoli, I immediately imagined a small Italian restaurant with an old gray-haired nonna in the kitchen wielding a wooden spoon. While Slisk does the cooking and Griff plays host, Zane is in charge of washing dishes and seeing to the maintenance of the serving droids that were packed aboard the Little Bivoli. Apparently, the previous owners didn't take much good care of them, and they sometimes glitch while doing their job. This ends up introducing Zane to a few familiar faces, the first two being Saul Karath and his right-hand man Morvis. As you may recall, Karath was introduced, or I guess reintroduced to us, in Flashpoint at the Battle of Vanquo. He was a captain then, but apparently a lot of his superior officers were killed in that battle, necessitating a rapid promotion to the rank of admiral, which is pretty impressive. Assuming that Star Wars navies are similar to modern navies, there are at least 3 ranks between captain and admiral. But they're not the only familiar faces. While Karath and Morvis are both officious and hostile, Zane soon finds a friendlier face of the Republic Navy in the form of one Lieutenant Carthonasi. According to interviews, Miller and the creative team worked extra hard to make sure that Carthonasi's character here would be consistent with that of his character in Knights of the Old Republic, the game. And apparently they succeeded so well that, just like in the video game, Carth Onasi basically spills out most of his life story to a kid he just barely met after a simple query. A detail that Miller only noticed in hindsight after the fact. He talks about his wife and child back on Telos 4, his then fairly positive opinion of Admiral Karath, the Navy's strategy for countering the oncoming Mandalorians, and even explains what exactly his role is here. Lieutenant Onasi is apparently in charge of a vessel known as the Deadweight, a transport ship meant to move troops and vehicles from the ground to space and back again. This is in fact a direct reference to Miller's grandfather's service in World War II. During the war, there were these ships called landing ship tanks, or LSTs. These were amphibious vessels designed to be able to beach themselves and then pull back out again, allowing for the deployment of troops and vehicles without the need of docking facilities. Miller's grandfather served aboard just such a vessel, the USS LST-560, and the serial number of the deadweight is CBX-560. As for strategy, Sirocco has two main continents, one that is really prosperous and another that is really poor. Knowing that the Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders are now more interested in actually claiming worlds they conquer instead of just smashing them completely, the Navy has positioned itself over the poor continent and deployed the army there in force. Presumably, if the Mandalorians want Sirocco, and if they want to have it intact and useful to them, they will have to avoid damaging the prosperous continent and land on the poor one, which means in order to have the world, they have to fight through the Navy and Army to get it. And so, having exhausted all his dialogue options for this encounter, Onasi departs. But not before he sees Zane show kindness to one of Sirocco's natives who apparently can't afford to pay for a meal. He gives him some extra credits to cover the tab and departs. Despite the Republic's confidence that this time they'll stop the Mandos for sure, Zane remains unconvinced. Unfortunately, Griff is making such a killing out of the little Bivoli that he is reluctant to heed Zane's advice that maybe they ought to leave before the battle begins. 1, the Snivian is almost literally rolling in credits, and 2, unlike on Vanquo, there's an army between them and the Mandos, so he doesn't see the danger. However, when Zane tries to find a moment of peace, it is utterly shattered by a sudden and unexpected Jedi vision. And it is a vision of apocalyptic destruction on the orders of Mandalore the Ultimate. As soon as he's recovered from the vision, Zane hurries off to warn Griff, telling them to take the little Bivoli into space now. As for himself, he needs to find a way to get into space and warn the Admiral. He manages to sneak aboard the deadweight before it takes off, only to be caught shortly thereafter by Carth Onasi. Naturally, the pilot has a hard time believing Zane's claim to be a Jedi or that he had a vision of the future, but a little trick of the Force manages to persuade him of the former. Still, he questions the veracity of Zane's vision, and the young former Padawan has to admit that Jedi foresight isn't always reliable. This causes Onasi to beg the question, is there a limit to what you ought to do to stop one of these visions from coming true? Would you kill someone? Zane responds that that would be a hard decision. He knows all too well what happens when people decide that the answer is unequivocally yes. Zane uses the deadweight's comm to alert Griff and remind him to leave Sirocco before it's too late, but the Snivian's greed has gotten the better of him, and he's more interested in making even more credits than paying heed to his henchman's warning. Zane and Onasi do manage to get an audience with Admiral Karath aboard his flagship, the Courageous. Unfortunately, Admiral Karath knows Zane all too well, or at least the official version of Zane, and so believes not only that he is the murderer of the Padawans, but also a Mandalorian spy, see Flashpoint. Unfortunately, Zane doesn't have much to counter such a hostile audience. The best he can do is insist that what he's doing is trying to save the people of Sirocco from what is to come. He tries to invoke Squint, the Jedi he met back on Flashpoint, as someone who would vouch for him. But unfortunately, Alec only gave his real name to Jarail, and so Zane doesn't know it, which only makes his argument look even weaker in the eyes of Admiral Karath. He does unbend enough to have Carthonasi contact the Jedi Order to see if he can locate this squint whose real name Zane doesn't know, to see if they can corroborate. After all, the Jedi are looking for the Padawan murderer anyway. Down on the surface of Sirocco, Griff is finally ordering Slisk to start packing up the little Bivoli, only for the Trandoshan to inform him that they don't have enough fuel to even make it off the planet, let alone hyperspace. And that's when the first air raid sirens signal the arrival of the Mandalorians. Karath and the fleet brace themselves as the first missiles are launched, but they don't aim for the fleet. The Mandalorian attack goes around it and toward the planet's surface. The result is apocalyptic, the equivalent of a mass nuclear bombardment. Both continents, the rich and the poor, whether populated by humans or by the alien natives, are glassed in instants. Sirocco is lit up with all-consuming fire that destroys everything in the blink of an eye. Zane, even with his own weak connection to the Force, is nearly crippled by the pain and fear of millions of deaths, of millions of voices crying out in terror, only to be suddenly silenced. The death agonies of Sirocco's population echoes across the Force. The Revankists feel it. The Covenant feel it. Zane's terrible vision has come to pass, and all because Mandalore the Ultimate saw the Republic's defensive strategy and decided to show them exactly what he thought of that and of them, as well as what he is capable of. Sirocco's death was a display of Mandalorian ruthlessness and Mandalorian contempt for their enemies. Only 8 ships are reported to have gotten off-world before the bombardment. The little Bivoli was not one of them. The bombardment of Sirocco would later be denounced as a heinous war crime and provide an ample source of Republic military propaganda. Meanwhile, the fact that the vast majority of the Jedi, including the High Council, would insist on remaining neutral even after such an atrocity would only widen the rift between them and the Revankists, a rift that would ultimately lead to civil war and the near annihilation of the Jedi Order. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As he stares at the fiery ruin of Sirocco, Admiral Karath is at a complete loss as what to do. The only thing he's able to do, it seems, is to order Zane locked up in the brig. He still fully intends to hand Zane over to the Jedi. As the Admiral himself puts it, he doesn't know if Zane is a traitor, a spy, or just crazy, and he's not smart enough to know. The Jedi are. Later in his cell, a despondent Zane receives a visit from Carthonasi. Unfortunately, there is little that the lieutenant can do but offer the faintest thread of hope. He was able to track down the Jedi Alec, only he was away on a mission and so never received the message. However, while he was doing that, he also sent off at least 17 distress signals to various communities on the surface of Sirocco. It used to be a prank when he was a younger, more assholish junior officer, scaring the natives into scurrying for the nearest shelter by warning them of severe ion storms. However, ion storms are a real threat on Sirocco, and as such, the locals have underground bunkers. So there is a chance that Griff and Slisk might still be alive. It's a faint hope, but with Zane still wallowing in grief over his failure to prevent the terrible vision from coming to pass, it's all he has left. In fact, Miller based Zane's reaction off of his own feelings when he first heard of 9/11. In fact, the cover art of the third and final issue of Days of Fear was inspired both by Miller's reaction to that terrible news and the cover art of issue 187 of Marvel's Daredevil. Once again, it seems that fortune just doesn't favor the Republic cause. But for now, we must take our leave of young Zane and the mystery of whether or not Griff and Slisk may yet be among the living, as it's about time we follow up on what's happening with Jarael and Camper in Knights of Anger. Until then.